This is Duke University.
This year represents the 40th anniversary of Roe v. Wade. But Roe v. Wade has a very different history when it relates to women of color. Today we're joined by Gaylon Alcaraz, who is the director of the Chicago Abortion Fund, and Cynthia Greenlee, who is someone who works with the North Carolina Abortion Fund, as we talk about Roe v. Wade and its impact on poor women and women of color. My name is Mark Anthony Neal, and this is Left of Black.
Yeah. Eric, you're a real life G for this one. Yeah.
Welcome to Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we're joined this afternoon via Skype. Gaylon Alcaraz, who is an activist and organizer and director of the Chicago Abortion Fund. And we're joined in studio by Cynthia Greenlee, a doctoral student here in history at the Duke University, who works on the history of black girlhood and law in the 19th century, and whose forthcoming book project is the history of African Americans and abortion starting in the early 19th century to now. How are you doing today, ladies?
We're good.
Great.
We are, of course, now celebrating the 40th anniversary of Roe v. Wade. And of course, Roe v. Wade has been something that has come up over and over again. It has been definitely a political football. Talk a little bit, Gaylon, about the work that you do at the Chicago Abortion Fund, particularly around these notions of reproductive justice.
Well, first of all, thank you, Mark, for having me on today. And just like you said, Roe v. Wade has been this political football since, 40 years ago. It's been, in a constant political battle with, the pro-choice and the anti-choice going back and forth. And one of the things that we are working on, Chicago Abortion Fund, we're a fund, so we help poor women pay for their procedures, particularly in their second trimester, which starts at 12 weeks. And before I came on board in 2005, it primarily was just direct client services, helping women pay for their procedures. I came to Chicago Abortion Fund coming from a community organizing background. And so, I really began to think about why the women that we were serving weren't engaged in this process with us. And I began a process to have them, join us. We started following up with women. We started calling them back. We started providing them with additional resources and support and bringing them back into the organization to engage them in this. That was a part of reproductive justice, even though I did not have the language around it. The reproductive justice framework was coined in the 90s by women of color that were caucusing primarily at a white pro-choice conference. And it was determined that this conference was not really touching on everything that women of color were dealing with. It was about not just abortion, but about an entire woman's life. And so I was doing that work, but I didn't have any language around that. And as I became more and more engaged in our community, because this is my first, foray into the reproductive, justice movement and the pro-choice movement. I did a lot of work around women and gender studies and things like that, but nothing in pro-choice. I've had abortions, but I went to the March for Women's Lives, but I didn't know anything about it. So even though I was doing the work, until I really got engaged into the work and, figured out this language and began to talk to people that were in this movement, that I realized that we were doing reproductive justice work by engaging the women, our former grantees, back into our organization. And so we bring them back in. We provide them with leadership development, empowerment. We basically give them this platform to make their voices heard around these issues that are important to them. And so we allow these women, these marginalized poor women, to be a part of the discourse. And that's something that's not being heard. You have a lot of, talking heads I'm sure some people will consider me now a talking head, but you have all these talking heads at the top, and you don't have the women that are mostly impacted. Their voice is not anywhere in the conversation. And so that was my whole point, is to get the former grantees back into the organization and have their voices heard. And so that's what we're doing around reproductive justice, is ensuring that the voices that are most impacted are being heard in this movement.
You're watching Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined by Gaylon Alcaraz from Chicago, where she is the director of the Chicago Abortion Fund. We're also joined in studio by Cynthia Greenlee, a graduate student here at Duke University, but also a member of the Carolina Abortion Fund. You know, Cynthia, we live in a society that necessarily is not warm and fuzzy about black women or black children. Callous might be the best way to describe the interaction with black women and children. But we've seen all of these posters show up, these billboards show up in black communities over the last 2 years, making a distinct point between abortion and genocide within the black community. How do you respond to those kinds of tactics, which, you know, clearly is trying to tap into a conservative sensibility, social sensibility within black communities? Again, you know, Gaylon is working in Chicago, which might be thought of as more progressive and even cosmopolitan. You know, in Carolina, it's a very different kind of landscape in terms of talking about reproductive justice.
Well, I think, you know, people frequently make the argument to me that abortion is not a black woman's issue. And I say that, you know, we can look at the numbers and we can say that's totally not true. So if we think about abortion overall in the United States, like 1 out of 3 American women will have an abortion in her lifetime. When we look at women of color, you know, particularly African American women or women who identify as black, whether they're African American or not, get about 1/3 of the abortions in the United States every year. So the numbers tell us, you know, that this is clearly a black woman's issue. But, you know, the idea of abortion as black genocide has a really, really long history. And that history, you know, goes back to, you know, the history of slavery. You know, one of the first legal cases I know, and I'm a legal historian, is of an enslaved black woman who is, her master impregnates her. This is based on coercion, and he tries to make her have an abortion in the year 1686 in Massachusetts. So this is not something new. It didn't happen before Roe v. Wade. But what I tell people is that African Americans particularly have been at the forefront of the abortion rights movement since before there really was a movement. So, you know, we can talk about whether or not black women practiced reproductive resistance during slavery, whether or not, and that's like a big historical debate, whether or not they decided to end their pregnancy to deny the master the fruits of their womb, right? To enrich the master. But we can also look, if you look at the mortality rates of black women during the illegal era of abortion, go to New York City, and you can see that 90-some% of the women were black and Puerto Rican women in New York City who died from illegal abortions. But we have been in the movement, and not just in the movement to protest about abortion, but in the movement to really fight for abortion access. So some of the earliest legal precedents, the case that liberalized abortion in New York City and New York State, actually the counsels for that, many of the counsels, the lawyers, were African American, and they were also African American lawyers who were civil rights lawyers. So we didn't see this division that like abortion rights had nothing to do with civil rights. And we can keep bringing it forward. There are people like Gaylon working in the movement. There are so many African American women and some men who actually work in abortion providing clinics. You often don't see them. So often we think with this kind of genocide argument that the faces behind Planned Parenthood or abortion providing clinics are white faces, and very often they are not.
You're watching Left of Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined in studio by Cynthia Greenlee, who is a member of the Carolina Abortion Fund, also a graduate student in history here at Duke University. We're joined from Chicago via Skype by Gaylon Alcaraz, who is the director of the Chicago Abortion Fund and involved in many different ways around these kinds of issues of reproductive justice. Gaylon, could you talk a little bit about, you know, what kind of challenges there are to have to talk about reproductive justice, particularly around issues of policy? Has it been difficult to find political partners, elected officials, that are really on board to be supportive of pushing back against some more conservative strains around reproductive justice?
So, Also, earlier, someone said that we're in a more liberal state. I'm going to have to disagree.
I got you. Gotcha.
We're probably more liberal than Mississippi, but we really have a lot of anti-choice legislators, including not only Republicans, including Democrats as well. We have a lot of anti-choice legislators that look like me, that are against choice. And so we constantly have this battle. With the most recent election, we have more pro-choice elected officials that have been, elected back into their seats, or just being elected. However, we'll have to see how that goes. People, run on one platform, and then sometimes they get in and they are on another whole different platform. So we're not really sure. But in terms of the challenges that we've been facing, I just want to give just a little sort of overview. Chicago Abortion Fund is a almost 30-year-old organization started by pro-choice feminists back in the 80s. And so we're one of the oldest feminist organizations, along with the Chicago Women's Health Center, that's still in existence here in Chicago. Because of the work that we do primarily around second trimester funding, we don't get the same type of opportunities that a Planned Parenthood would get in terms of donors, in terms of people wanting to join our board, in terms of volunteers or people wanting to support us. Because
Gaylon, talk about that a little bit for a second, right? The distinction between the first trimester abortions and second trimester abortions. For the audience who might not understand those particular distinctions.
Okay, well, a second trimester abortion starts at 12 weeks, and it is riskier. It costs a whole lot more, and sometimes a young woman will have to go to the clinic for several days for her procedure, and so it's always good to, if you have decided on having a procedure, an abortion, you should get it done as soon as possible. Right. When it is less risky and when it doesn't cost as much. Primarily, the reason why our mission services second trimester procedures is because, over 90% of the women that we serve are on some form of governmental assistance. And so they don't have the money to pay for a first trimester.
Right.
They're trying to gather up the money to pay. They're transitioning week by week. So week by week, it continues to go up in cost.
Wow.
And so that's what the difference is.
And this becomes a crisis, particularly for Black and brown women and white women, poor white women in this regard.
Exactly. And all of this really comes out of the Hyde Amendment. Poor women cannot pay for their procedures with their medical card, because if they could, they would have their abortions much, much earlier. A woman doesn't wait till her second trimester to have an abortion. Right. She wants to, if she's made the decision and she wants to have it, she's going through the steps to try to get there. And because she is on some type of governmental assistance, or she's relying on others for financial support, she cannot, or even if she's working at a low-end job, like, fast food industry or retail, she cannot pay for her procedure while making sure that she pays for the daily care of her children, her family, her rent, her necessities. And so that's why we focus on second trimester. And let me see, where else was I going? So, we don't have the same type of opportunities as like a Planned Parenthood would have. Right. Because, you have a lot of people that say, I'm pro-choice, but I'm only pro-choice to a certain point.
Right.
When you start to get to second trimester, oh no, I don't want to deal with it like that. And so that's where a lot of our challenges are. And then on top of that, because a Planned Parenthood or another pro-choice organization has a lot more funding and resources, Planned Parenthood gets governmental funding. We don't get that. We raise all our money from individual donors and a handful of foundations. And so we can't access the same type of resources on a lot of different levels. And that's what makes it challenging, because then when we want to go and talk to legislators, it's like we're a little bitty voice in this really big swimming pool. And the ones that have the biggest fishing pole is the ones that people listen to. And so they're going to listen to a Planned Parenthood person that comes to the table. You know, when we try to come to the table, you know, it's like not taking us as seriously, even though they're kind of still shocked to see women of color coming and talking to them. So we deal with a lot of different challenges on a lot of different levels.
You have anything to add, Cynthia?
No, I was thinking about it, and I think a lot of people don't understand the economics of abortion. And so if you think about what abortion, first of all, is a very safe, commonly performed procedure, especially in the first trimester. But if you're looking at the average cost of a first trimester abortion before those 12 weeks, it's almost about $500 around the country. And then the clock starts ticking and the price goes up. So here in North Carolina, if you're a woman who needs a second trimester procedure, you're probably going to be in trouble. One, you're going to have to drive. If you can find someone who will perform that procedure in your state, there are some states that don't have very many abortion providers. We have like 18 in North Carolina. Then you're going to have to pay up to, you know, thousands of dollars in some cases to get a second trimester procedure. If you're driving, then because it's a multiple day procedure, that means you probably are going to have to get off work. And that may be a job where you don't have vacation time. And you're going to have to find a hotel stay. You're going to have gas money to get to that place. And that's one of the things that we work on. Even though the Carolina Abortion Fund funds people's procedures only, we talk to women about ways in which they can find ways to get that $30 of gas. So, you know, if you don't have that, you know, $300 for your abortion at Planned Parenthood, and, you know, I'm just throwing that out, but that's fairly typical cost, then you aren't going to have the $30 to go and get gas to put in your car if you have one. And we see that most of the women who come to us, almost all of them are very underemployed women if they have a job. They are a step away from homelessness. Almost all of them, and I want to say this and I want to say it really clearly, almost all of them already have children. So we should not be stigmatizing women who have abortion as people who don't care about children. Very often it's a really responsible decision that involves taking care of the children you already have and caring for yourself.
You're watching Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined by Gaylon Alcaraz from Chicago, where she is the director of the Chicago Abortion Fund. We're also joined in studio by Cynthia Greenlee, who is a member of the Carolina Abortion Fund and also a graduate student, PhD student in the Department of History here at Duke University. If both of you could talk a little bit about the legacy of Roe v. Wade and where we go forward. You know, there's not a day in which there's not some conversation about what the Supreme Court looks like and when the Supreme Court is going to take on the business of reversing Roe v. Wade. It's almost in some sectors an expectation that this particular court will take that on at some point. If you both could talk a little bit about that kind of threat, but also just to talk in general about the legacy of Roe v. Wade.
Well, Gaylon, you want me to take this one first?
Go here first.
Okay. Well, I think we don't even need to really rely on the Supreme Court to try to reverse Roe v. Wade, because if you look, so we're in North Carolina, and North Carolina, we went from being a state that had a relatively progressive abortion policy. We even had a state-funded, government-funded abortion fund that would help poor and indigent women get their procedures. And then with the change in our state house, when both our state House of Representatives and our Senate become Republican in 2010, then in the blink of an eye, we see all this anti-choice legislation, which then happens and we change our abortion law for the first time. So a lot of the work is being done chipping away at state policies. So we don't need to have, you know, anybody on the bench up there in Washington to change it, because states are doing a really effective job at hindering women's access. Now that said, you know, there are a lot of people who are fighting to roll back some of that anti-choice tie. You know, you think about African American communities specifically, you know, the Mississippi Personhood Amendment, which was going to imbue the fetus with a lot of rights. It was going to march us towards seeing the fetus on being on par with a person who is already born, an adult, you, here, and me. A lot of that was defeated in Mississippi because of the votes of students at historically black colleges. Now, that's not a story that we hear in this movement, and very often it's about how we frame the movement, and that this movement is seen as a middle-class white woman's movement. But none of us can afford to really let that stand, because all of us will be affected in some way by abortion policies, also by personhood amendments that basically take aim at birth control. And we know that even many people who say they're against abortion actually approve of it in circumstances when it comes close to home, and they also use birth control. So people often look at the religious conflicts. Well, something like 60% of Catholics use birth control in this country. So it's religion plays a big role, but at the same time, people understand what their lives are like and the toll it takes if they have to become parents when they're not ready.
Gaylon?
I definitely agree with you, Cynthia, on pretty much everything that you said. There is an effort across the country to chip away at the state rights, and that's proven very, very effective for the anti-choice movement. I do want to add that I think this is where the pro-choice and the reproductive justice movement is kind of splintered. These are, silos that we're working from. So you have, the reproductive rights movement that's specifically working on rights. Then you have the health movement that's, the whole health, and you have the justice movement that's working on the entire woman's life. Yeah. And when you have, abortion is supposed to be legal right now, but there's an access issue. Right. So for a whole lot of women, it's not legal. And so, that effort, even though, passing Roe v. Wade got us to a certain point and it was good overall for everyone, we need to think about a different type of movement that will forward us, that will move us along into the future. And that's where reproductive justice comes in, because it's not just about abortion. It is also about parenting the children that we already have. And we need additional supports for that. And so if you can't parent the children that you already have, why would you want to bring more children into the world? If all the governmental supports like, affordable housing and, comprehensive sex education and, the economy, economic justice, and all these different things, the prison industrial system, all these things come into play in a reproductive justice framework, because women are not being provided, poor and marginalized women are not being provided with the supports necessary to sustain themselves and their families and their children. And so if we continue to fight for, let's just keep it legal, that is not going to work in our favor down the line, because there is a state-by-state movement to dismantle the policies in each state around these access issues. And we're already dealing with a major, major access issue around the Hyde Amendment. So that's why we think that the reproductive justice framework is the way to go as we move into the future.
We've been joined this afternoon by Gaylon Alcaraz from Chicago via Skype, where she is the director of the Chicago Abortion Fund. We've been joined in studio by Cynthia Greenlee, PhD candidate in the Department of History here at Duke University and someone who works with the Carolina Abortion Fund. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, ladies.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Eric, you're a real life G for this one. Yeah. All black everything. All black, All black in the name of all my black heroes. All black everything. All black polos. All black medallions, yeah. All black, say. All black everything. All black, All black in the name of all my black heroes.